All right, thanks for tuning in and for the opportunity to share our story as well as some of the unique services my staff and I offer. Now, I realize you're probably very busy and don't have a lot of time, so during the next few minutes, I'm going to condense what is usually an hour-long lecture into about 15 or 16 minutes. Now, for those of you who may not know me, my name is Marco Rodriguez, along with my beautiful wife, Diane. We own Transformations Rehab Services in El Paso, Texas. Diane and I, we've been OTs now for over 25 years. Diane used to work for the Isleta School District, and I worked for one of the local hospitals. You know, and I always like to point out, Diane and I were very happy at our jobs and thought that's what we would do our entire careers. But how many of you know that there are times when life will throw you a curveball? And for us, that came in the form of my son, Patrick. This is my son, Patrick, and very early in his life, he was diagnosed with multiple neurologic atypicalities such as ADD, ADHD, social anxiety disorder, and so forth. And, you know, it seemed like they could never quite figure out or pinpoint what was the main issues that were going on with Patrick. So initially, we did what any good parent would do. We tried all of the traditional interventions such as OT, behavioral modification, and so forth. And, you know, it seemed like we tried every medication under the sun. Now, unfortunately, Patrick's system is very sensitive, so it seemed like if there was a side effect to a particular medication, Patrick got it. So every time we'd go back to the pediatrician, they would try to increase the dose or decrease the dose, or the pediatrician would say, let's try to combine this medication with this medication, and let's just see how that works. So after a while, it dawned on me that they were simply guessing. Now, that's certainly not a criticism to the physicians. I understand they were doing their best. They simply lacked the proper tools. And I don't know about you, but my son's life was not going to be a game of chance that we were going to play until we finally found the right combination. So I went to work researching in PubMed.gov, which is our National Library of Medicine, as well as looking at what other cities were doing that, you know, maybe we weren't. And what I found was both disturbing as well as relieving. And what I found was that 78 to 80% of children or persons with these neurologic atypicalities have several biomarkers in common, such as brainwave dysregulation, low levels of glutathione, which is a very powerful antioxidant enzyme. Low levels of glutathione tend to lead to high levels of oxidative stress, which then leads to mitochondrial dysfunction. Especially vulnerable are the brain cells. So you have high levels of inflammation in the brain. And of course, when you throw in a poor diet into the mix, you get a poor gut biome. And none of the medications that are being given to any of these people is doing anything to address these issues. Now, I'm certainly not anti-medication, and the 62 physicians who currently refer their patients to us will back me up on this, that we simply cannot resolve the issues that these people are having by simply having them pop a pill. Hopefully that makes sense. So in the early 2000s, I became certified in neurofeedback and started working with Patrick at home. He'd go to school, I'd go to work, we'd come home in the evenings, and I would work with him a couple nights a week. Now, initially, there was not a lot of progress, and what I realized was that this isn't magic. This is science, and it takes time. Suffice to say that Patrick began to make some progress, so much so that teachers began to notice, his pediatrician and his neurologist began to notice. In fact, it was his pediatrician and neurologist who encouraged us to establish an outpatient rehab clinic dedicated to providing the same services that had worked so well with Patrick. So in 2010, we started as a contract service for another clinic, but by 2013, we had grown so much that we decided to establish our own independent rehab clinic. Now, we've been blessed. We now have one of the largest clinics of its kind in the country. We initially started with just the one neurofeedback system. We now have 9 neurofeedback systems, currently treating over 300 treatment visits every week. And 99% of our patients come from the 62 referring physicians in the El Paso and surrounding area. We see both pediatric as well as adults, civilians, as well as military personnel, all with a variety of diagnoses from ADD, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, bipolar disorder, psychotic disorders, and so forth. Now, why is all of this relevant to you and your population? Well, we know that between 50 and 75% of all prison inmates are what we call neuroatypicals, whether that be psychotic disorders, bipolar disorders, major depression. And look at this, between 25 and 40% of the prison population have ADHD, and many times it's accompanied by ODD, which is oppositional defiant disorder. Now, studies show that when you compare the brains of persons with ADHD and persons with criminal backgrounds, there's a lot of similarities. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of those similarities, as well as how some of the services that we provide at our clinic can help. We're going to start with the amygdala. Now, we know that the amygdala is responsible for the generation and the regulation of emotions such as anger and fear. And there are numerous studies showing a decrease in the function of the amygdala in persons with ADHD that is comparable to those who are within the prison population. Now, the hippocampus, much like the amygdala, assists in the emotional learning and fear conditioning. And we now know that when the hippocampus is not functioning as it should, inappropriate, illegal, and even violent behaviors tend to emerge. Now, the troika in all of this is the prefrontal lobe. It acts as a gatekeeper to your emotions. Now, the prefrontal lobe is in charge of your executive functioning, controlling emotional responses that's produced in the limbic system, of course, which the amygdala and hippocampus are a part of. So it's also active in problem solving and judgment. In other words, it prevents us from acting solely on our impulses. And numerous studies show that persons with low functioning prefrontal lobes not only tend to have difficulties with paying attention, hyperactivity, but they also demonstrate an inability to control their impulses. So for a person struggling with this trifecta of neurologic dysfunctions, it's nearly impossible for them to control their responses, especially when involved in an emotionally taxing situation. And since we know life is always going to have stressful moments, their maladaptive behavior becomes chronic, hence the high recidivism rate. Now, I work with teenagers a lot in my church as well as in my clinic. And when I asked most of them about their behavior and what it was they did or what was going through their head when they made their poor choices, most of them just kind of shrug their shoulders and say that they don't know. They truly were not thinking about the consequences. And you know what? They're not lying. When you have a dysfunctional prefrontal lobe, they literally are not thinking about the consequences. They simply react as best they can with the equipment that they have. They simply have faulty equipment. So my question is this: if we know that this is true, what can we do to positively impact this at-risk population? Because we know that popping pills and reincarceration is not the long-term solution. So at Transformations, everything is based upon the initial QEEG brain map study, along with the comprehensive evaluation by one of our MOTs. Now, if you go into the National Library of Medicine, you'll find over 200 studies proving the efficacy of brain mapping. Of course, the information retrieved from the initial evaluation helps to drive the patient-specific plan of care, which utilizes neurofeedback and OT intervention. As you can see here, there are nearly 2,000 studies demonstrating the efficacy of neurofeedback. And what's even more interesting is how that number skyrocketed just within the last 10 years. In fact, 92.7% of all the studies on neurofeedback have come within the last 10 years. Now, for those of you who don't understand what that means, I'll explain it this way. They're not spending millions of dollars studying this because they have nothing better to do. They're doing it because the technology has made neurofeedback into a very powerful ally. Quite simply, we know it works, whether that be schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, ADHD, or whatever issue a person is having related to the neurological patterns. Neurofeedback, which utilizes the principles of operant conditioning, can help to retrain self-regulation and brainwave activity. In fact, as it relates to ADHD, the American Academy of Pediatrics, which is the governing body for all pediatricians, published an article in which they themselves highlighted the benefits of neurofeedback. Now, our clinic is not just a brain mapping and neurofeedback clinic. As I mentioned at the start, my wife and I are both occupational therapists. In addition, we have 3 master's or doctorate level OTs, in addition to 5 CODAs. We also have a number of speech and language pathologists on board. And as I mentioned before, we work with over 62 physicians, nurse practitioners, and or psychologists in the area. Now, okay, so I'm going to spend the next few minutes explaining in the most simple terms how brain mapping and neurofeedback work, all right? Now, some of you may already know that the brain is made up of over 100 billion interconnected neurons, and those neurons or brain cells are in constant communication with each other. You know, your brain never sleeps. Now, that communication happens 2 ways. One is chemical, the other one is electrical. Electrically, we can measure it with an EEG. Now, with our QEEG brain mapping technology, we now have the capability of taking a 3-dimensional image of the brain's electrical activity. And as you can see here we see a person with an extremely unstable hippocampus activity. And as we mentioned earlier, this has been linked to persons with antisocial and even violent behaviors. Actually, with this person, the dysfunction extends beyond the hippocampus. It extends throughout the brain. So here we see that the delta waves have a standard deviation of 12.7. Now, just to put that into perspective, a standard deviation of 2, whether positive or negative, is considered within normal based on a nationwide database. And when you look at the improvements over the course of 10 months, it's still slightly high, but it's doing much better. Again, keep in mind, this isn't magic. We're talking about science here, and of course it takes time. But this person's standard deviations have gone from 12.7 to 4.5 in a matter of 10 months. And this same individual exhibited dysfunction in several different areas of the brain and in several other frequencies. For example, the theta waves show a standard deviation of 10.3. After that same 10-month period of time, that standard deviation was reduced to 4.9, which is obviously a significant improvement. In addition, when we're looking at beta scores, we see a reduction from 7.4 to 4.2. More importantly, look how much quieter the brain is overall. In the first brain map study, nearly the entire brain is affected, with the exception of the left prefrontal lobe. Now, 10 months later, the majority of the brain has quieted down, with a small exception of the occipital region. Now, that's made a significant impact in this child's learning abilities, which of course translates into greater self-confidence and a more cooperative individual. All of this without the use of medication. All right, now with this is an example of a child with a very different brain function. During his first brain map study in February of 2020, his delta waves exhibited a standard deviation of negative 14.9. 9 months later, the child made significant progress and is now at a standard deviation of 2.3, which falls within the normal range. Take a look at his theta scores. Standard deviation of negative 12.9. 9 months later, again within the normal range of 2.7. If we look at the alpha waves, he starts with a standard deviation of negative 8.3. 9 months later, it is within standard deviations of 3.2. And I could just go on and on about the different results that we've had with the hundreds of kids that we've seen. So hopefully all of that is making sense. Now, I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so I'm going to wrap it up by saying this. We want to help, and we want to help your kids. Now, I want you to think about all the kids that you've had on your caseload over the years, and some of you may not remember their names or even their faces, but ask yourself, how many of them could have been helped if we only knew what was actually going on inside their brain? And I understand that's an overwhelming thought, and we can't go back and do anything about them, but we can do something about the ones we have now. And I understand it takes effort, and you're probably already overworked and possibly underpaid, and you might be thinking that you just don't have time. And listen, I get that. But if we really believe in No Child Left Behind, then don't they all deserve the right to know? So here's what we're willing to do. My wife and I, we've been blessed. We're not rich, but we do make a living. So I want to give back. Nationally speaking, the brain map studies cost anywhere between $500 and $1,000. Our clinic usually charges about $400, and I really don't care about that. Let's help the kids. So I will provide a comprehensive brain map study at no charge for each and every one of your kids. The process is very simple. You make the recommendation. You don't need to play doctor, just make the connection. We will work to get the initial referral for a comprehensive evaluation to include the brain map study. Once we do that, we will schedule the initial evaluation. Once we complete the evaluation, that evaluation is then sent over to the primary care physician for their approval and their signature. All of that is then faxed over to the respective insurance company for the final authorization. Once the physician has approved it and the insurance has authorized it, we will schedule the therapy sessions and begin treatment interventions. So you can rest assured that we will not be treating anyone that doesn't warrant our services. So I'm asking you to send every single one of your kids for an evaluation. They all deserve the right to know. And I understand you may have procurement protocols that you have to follow. Fine. If there is another local clinic that does what we do, send them half. Send us half. If there's 10 of us, fine, split it up evenly. Doesn't really matter to me. Let's just not play patty cake with these kids' future. And I understand, maybe I shouldn't have said it that way. I hope you understand my heart. I'm certainly not trying to make anyone mad. I just really want to help these kids, and so I hope that makes sense. So again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to share. I thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions, please feel free to give me a call. My contact information is down at the bottom. My direct contact information is at the bottom, my email and my cell number. Now that information is for you only. Please do not give it to your clients. I hope that makes sense. So again, thank you for the opportunity to share, and y'all have a blessed day.